Asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityor ma amritam gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the transient to the eternal. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all again. And Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy Hanukkah. Next week, I'm coming again, next Sunday, and I'll be speaking on the topic of, did Sri Ramakrishna really practice Christianity? If I had planned a little better, that topic probably would have been better for this week. But anyway, stay tuned for that next Sunday. But the topic today, God with form. My feeling is that God with form has a bit of a PR problem. People who believe in God, a lot of people believe in God, but a lot of people also have this kind of knee-jerk aversion to meditating on or thinking about God with form, divine forms. And one of the things we'll be talking about today is what exactly is God with form. But you hear it from many different quarters. So there are followers of non-duality who look down on God with form, and even the personal God in general, saying that's a lower truth, it's a lower reality. We believe in non-dual pure consciousness. And you devotees of God, especially God with form, you're okay, but maybe after a few lifetimes you'll come up to our level. So it can be very patronizing, condescending. But even among bhaktas, even among devotees who believe in a personal God, many of them also don't care to think about God with form. They prefer to think of God as formless but personal. I've heard this a lot. People who love kirtans, for instance, there are great singers like Krishna Das and others, and people will listen to music, get completely swept away by the words and the feeling, but they still can't stomach this idea of divine forms. I've heard this a lot from people, and some of you in the audience might be thinking along the same lines. And so, as the PR agent for God with Form, I want to make a case that it's not only okay, but actually beneficial for most people, for most spiritual aspirants, to believe in God with form and to incorporate divine forms into their daily spiritual practice in different ways. And we'll talk about what that might look like. So this talk will hopefully have three parts. So in the first part, I want to clarify and broaden what we mean by divine forms. Okay. And then second, the more philosophical side of my talk, I want to make an argument that based on the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and his own spiritual experiences, that divine forms are not lower truths, they're not hallucinations, they're not merely subjective, but they're fully real. So that meditation on God with form becomes a very powerful practice that can take us to the highest goal, which is liberation, God realization. And then finally, I want to talk about the practical payoff and as spiritual aspirants, what we can do to incorporate divine forms into our daily practice. And the overall gist of what I'm saying is if you're not already worshiping God with form and thinking about God with form, you probably should be. So first, what exactly is God with form? Immediately, we run into some, I think, ambiguities and also some confusion about what divine forms mean. Okay. First of all, I think it's really important within the context of Vedanta to distinguish four different terms. I'm going to give the Sanskrit and explain what each of them means. Okay. And if you imagine a kind of Cartesian coordinate system, you get two axes, right? Horizontal and vertical. So on the horizontal, we get on one side, nirakara, and on the other, sakara. Nirakara means formless, okay, without form. Akara means form, nirakara means without form. Sakara means with form. And on the vertical axis, we can put saguna and nirguna. Saguna, gunas mean attributes or qualities. So saguna means with personal qualities. So that means the personal God, saguna. And on the bottom side of the vertical axis, we have nirguna, which means devoid of attributes, impersonal. And then you can kind of plot points here, okay? So what are some of the main combinations within different religious traditions and spiritual traditions? You get, for instance, nirguna nirakara. That would be somewhere up there, right? Or no, down here, I think. So anyway, nirguna nirakara, which means what? The formless, impersonal absolute. Which spiritual tradition upholds this? Classical Advaita Vedanta, so the school of non-dualism. It's both formless and impersonal, okay? But there are many devotional traditions, bhakti traditions, which believe in saguna and sakara, which means they believe in the personal God. What do I mean by the personal God? That doesn't mean God in the form of a human being necessarily. The personal God just means that supreme being who creates and governs this world, who listens to our prayers, who responds to our prayers, who loves us, and so on and so forth. That's the idea. Who's omniscient, omnipotent, okay? That's the personal God. So now there are many traditions, devotional traditions, which believe in the personal God who also has form. And we'll talk about the different kinds of forms that can take. So that's saguna and sakara, okay? Whether that form is Christ or Ramakrishna or four-armed Kali or the elephant god Ganesha or so on. There's so many that you can think of, right? Those are all examples of the personal God with form. But then here's where I think confusion creeps in. There's another permutation that's possible here, which I think a lot of people either overlook or they misunderstand. You can believe in God as saguna but nirakara. Saguna, which means personal God, but nirakara, which means formless. So the mistake that some people make is to think that if you think of the divine as formless, then it can't be personal. But this is a serious mistake. Many traditions believe in the personal God without form. What are some examples? Well, think about Islam, for instance, one of the major world religions. They believe in the personal God. Allah is the personal God, but without form. It's part of their theological framework that God cannot have form. God cannot incarnate as a human being. God doesn't have any form whatsoever. It's formless, but personal, okay? And there are many traditions like that. Within Hinduism, you find certain movements, like the Brahma Samaj, for instance. The Brahma Samaj, which was very popular in Sri Ramakrishna's time in the 19th century, the followers of the Brahma Samaj believed in the personal God, so they were bhaktas, they were devotees, they worshipped the personal God, but they didn't believe in God with form. Another tradition in India, Sikhism, some of you I'm sure have heard of it, Sikhism. They also believe in the personal God, but without any kind of form. So there are a lot of traditions which believe in the personal God, but without form. But just because you think of God as formless doesn't mean that God is impersonal. That's the thing that I'm trying to emphasize here. It's really important to keep in mind. Formless does not equal impersonal. You can believe in God who is formless, but personal. Okay, so there are all these different combinations. Now, what do I mean by God with form, divine forms? Each of you can probably think of your own examples of what it means for God to have form. I'm going to give you just 7 examples relatively quickly. The first and most obvious, so when most people think of God with form or divine forms, what do they think of? They think of what God looks like. When you imagine God, the way that God is depicted, gods and goddesses are depicted within particular religious traditions, like in Hinduism. So for instance, in Hinduism, we have so many gods and goddesses, right? And each of them has a different form. We have the 8-armed Durga, Divine Mother. We've got the 4-armed Kali. We've got Ganesha, who's got the elephant's trunk. We have Hanuman, the monkey god. There's so many. Each of these have a distinct form. And in other Hindu traditions, you have like Vishnu, for instance, who also has a very distinct form. He's holding a mace, and so on. Okay, so that's a very common understanding of divine forms. But it's important not to limit divine forms to just those kinds of forms. Let me give you 6 other examples, and I'm sure you can come up with 4 to 10 more. We can talk about it in the Q&A. Another example of a divine form: divine incarnations. When God incarnates as a human being, that's another divine form. In fact, Sri Ramakrishna used to say, why does God incarnate as a human being? for us, for our sake. It's by the infinite grace of the divine that he or she manifests, incarnates in the form of a human being. Because we're human beings, so we can better relate to God and better establish a relationship with God if we see God in human form. That's another kind of divine form. And notice, that's very different from the four-armed Kali or Ganesha or Hanuman, right? So that's why it's a distinct form of the divine. Another example, God in the form of images. This is an image of Sri Ramakrishna, for instance, and there's so many, right? And you go to, especially Catholic churches, they're big on depicting the form of Jesus, for instance, and Mother Mary and so on. Those are all divine forms, right? And you can actually worship that image and realize the highest. Sri Ramakrishna did that. And he proved that the worship of divine images is an extremely potent spiritual practice. It's not a kind of lesser practice. In fact, there are some traditions which uphold the view that the divine image is actually an incarnation of the divine. So, for instance, Ramanuja, some of you are familiar with Ramanuja's tradition of Vishishtadvaita Vedanta. He has a beautiful concept. The Sanskrit term is Archa Avatara. Archa Avatara. Avatara means an incarnation of God. In the form of Archa. Archa means the divine image. So literally God is present in the divine image. And so by meditating on that image with love and concentration, you can actually directly realize God. Okay. But of course, there are many people who consider themselves rationalists and who look down on people who meditate on God in the form of images, and they dismiss it as so-called idol worship, right? But they're not idols, they're images. And in one of my books on Ramakrishna, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, I talk about a French philosopher named Jean-Luc Marion, M-A-R-I-O-N. He has this great idea called conceptual idolatry. See, there are many ways to engage in idol worship, okay? What is an idol? What does it mean to turn God into an idol? What it fundamentally means is limiting God in some way, circumscribing God within the parameters of our own puny intellects, our finite minds, okay? And one very common way that people do this is to say that God can only be X, Y, or Z and nothing more. Very common. That's a form of conceptual idolatry. It's a form of idol worship. By replacing the infinite divine with a limited concept of the divine. So what's a standard example? What's a good example in this context? Limiting God to the formless. That's a form of conceptual idolatry. That's the irony of this. So people who deny the possibility that God can assume forms and that image worship is a kind of lower practice or a useless practice, they're actually guilty of idol worship. They're guilty of idolatry in the form of conceptual idolatry. Okay. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, never place a limit to God. Never say God can only be this and nothing more. That's always important to keep in mind. God is both with form, without form, personal, impersonal, and much more besides. That's the view that we should take. So I've given you so far 3 forms of the divine. Let's give a few more. God in the form of human beings. Each one of us here, sitting here today, speaking here, we're all God in different forms. Swami Medhananda strongly emphasized this. And what he called practical Vedanta is actually trying to see God in every human being and serving them accordingly. He says, what is more practical than worshiping here? Worshiping you. I see you, feel you, and I know you are God. The Muslim says there is no God but Allah. The Vedanta says there is nothing that is not God. The living God is within you. And yet you are building churches and temples and believing all sorts of imaginary nonsense. The only God to worship is the human soul in the human body. Of course, all animals are temples too. But human beings are the highest, the Taj Mahal of temples. If I cannot worship in that, no other temple will be of any advantage. So very powerful words. This becomes a very powerful spiritual practice. Sri Ramakrishna used to call this practice Shiva Gyane Jivir Seva, which means serve others in a spirit of worship by trying to see the same divine equally in everyone. So that's a divine form, thinking of God in the form of human beings. That's not the same thing as an incarnation. Incarnations are special human forms of the divine. But each one of us is God in human form, but we're not incarnations. It's not. Sometimes with ChatGPT these days and AI, there's a Rolling Stone article about how there are things called AI-induced psychosis, and also AI-induced kind of spiritual megalomania, because ChatGPT especially has a tendency to flatter and become sycophantic. And so if you already have those kinds of tendencies, AI can easily convince you that you're the next Messiah. So we shouldn't think that we're avatars, that we're incarnations. But each of us are actually the divine in human form. Another form of the divine, God in the form of nature. Many people, they have trouble thinking about going to church and thinking of God in any form. But they love nature, and they love going on hikes. And they love just sitting in front of the ocean on the beach and just looking at it. They can stare at it for hours. Nature is also the divine. There's a whole tradition called nature mysticism, where you see the divine. You see the nature as divine. You see the divine in nature. I'll give you just one example. In an Indian context, Rabindranath Tagore is one of the famous poets and singers, songwriters who strongly emphasize divinity in nature. But I want to give you a Western example. This is from William Wordsworth. It's a sonnet he wrote in 1802. It is a beauteous evening, calm and free. It's short. It is a beauteous evening, calm and free. The holy time is quiet as a nun, breathless with adoration. The broad sun is sinking down in its tranquility. The gentleness of heaven broods o'er the sea. Listen, the mighty being is awake, and doth with his eternal motion make a sound like thunder everlastingly. Dear child, dear girl, that walkest with me here, if thou appear untouched by solemn thought, thy nature is not therefore less divine. Thou liest in Abraham's bosom all the year, and worshipest at the temple's inner shrine, God being with thee when we know it not. So even if you just love to think about nature, look at nature, dwell in nature, live in nature, that itself is communing with the divine. Swami Medhananda says something very similar. He says, the flowers that we see all around us are beautiful. Beautiful is the rising of the morning sun. Beautiful are the variegated hues of nature. The whole universe is beautiful, and man has been enjoying it since his appearance on earth. Sublime and awe-inspiring are the mountains, the gigantic rushing rivers rolling towards the sea, the trackless deserts, the infinite ocean, the starry heavens, and so on. Then he says, everything that you see, feel, or hear, the whole universe is God's creation. Or to be a little bit more accurate, is God's projection. Or to be still more accurate, is the Lord himself. Two more examples of divine forms. As I said, this is not exhaustive, and I encourage you to come up with your own forms of the divine. The mantra, the divine mantra, is another form of the divine, a very potent form of the divine. Some of you are initiated in some tradition. It could be ours, it could be a different one. And at least in a Vedanta context, initiation usually involves being given a mantra, a name of the divine. Don't think that it's just a name, that a name is just a symbol for something that's real. It itself is the divine. Sri Ramakrishna used to say the name and what that name signifies are one and the same. Nama and Namni are abhed. Okay. So by meditating on a mantra, by repeating a mantra, by doing what's called japa, which is a mental repetition of the mantra, you're directly invoking the divine in your heart. And then ultimately, that'll lead to direct realization, experiential realization of the divine. And then finally, but not finally, it's not exhaustive as I said, but another example is God in the form of our great spiritual scriptures, whatever they are, whether it's the Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads or the Bible or the Quran or the Buddha scriptures. Those are also God in different forms. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, Bhagavat Bhakto Bhagavan, one of these mantras that he would repeat, often in states of ecstasy. He would say, Bhagavata Bhakta Bhagavan. Bhagavata is one of the great Hindu scriptures, the Bhagavata Purana. Bhakta, a devotee of God, and Bhagavan, God himself, Krishna. They're one and the same. Bhagavata, Bhakta, Bhagavan are one and the same. So the scripture itself is a form of the divine. Brahmanandaji, the first president of our order, the Ramakrishna order, he used to say, whenever the mind starts sinking downward, one thing that you can do is to recite some verses from the Bhagavad Gita. By doing that, the mind immediately feels elevated. That's why we have some brahmacharis here and in Hollywood, where I'm based, and I encourage them from the beginning to memorize the scriptures. Whatever, your favorite verses, you don't have to memorize the whole thing, even if you don't have a very good memory. Just find verses that are especially important to you, especially meaningful to you spiritually, and memorize them. Why? Because you won't always have the scripture with you, the text with you. And if you don't, in those moments of trial, temptation, difficulty, challenges, if you've memorized a few of these really uplifting verses, you can just mentally recite them, repeat them out loud. And it really, when you memorize a verse, it really feels like it's coming from within. If you say it with feeling and with sincerity and concentration. And it can really help you out of many difficulties. Okay, now, with regard to the philosophical side of the talk today, how exactly should we look at divine forms? Are they real or are they lower truths, for instance? In technical philosophical language, the question would be, what is the ontological status of divine forms? Which means, are they just subjective hallucinations? Are they imaginative fancies? Or are they real? And if they are real, how is that even possible? What does it mean for a divine form to be real? Okay. So different traditions in India give different answers to this question, actually. I already mentioned some traditions throughout the world that don't believe in God with form. Okay. But they still believe in a personal God. So Advaita Vedanta, for instance, says that divine forms, and even the personal God as such, even the formless personal God, are lower truths. They're true from the empirical standpoint, but not from the highest standpoint. From the highest standpoint, when we've overcome all ignorance and realized our true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, then we realize that the personal God, all the divine forms, they were not really true. They were illusory. But we only realize that when we realize our true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. Until then, it's good to believe in these forms, basically. Okay, so that's one tradition. But then, of course, the opposite's also true. You find everything in Hinduism. That's one of the great things about Hinduism, is that there's something for everyone, and it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of religion. And so you find these wonderful devotional traditions, bhakti traditions, which are all about God with form. And they say, no, divine forms are not some kind of lower truth. They're the ultimate truth. But then again, you find among the different devotional traditions in India that they sometimes have a tendency to kind of put their form of the divine on a higher pedestal than other forms of the divine. My Ganesha is better than your Hanuman. My Kali is better than your Krishna. My Krishna is better than everyone, and so on and so forth. So even when you believe in a divine form, typically people tend to place the form of God that they love the most above other forms. This is another common problem we find. Okay. Now, in this context, Sri Ramakrishna's life and teachings become extremely important and illuminating. Okay. And we can start actually with, as many of you know, he had many spiritual experiences, kind of countless. His very first spiritual experiences is, to my mind, the most fascinating one in a way, and the most cryptic. His first experience, some of you know this, he became so desperate to realize God that he saw a sword in a scabbard, and he went to reach out for that knife to slit his own throat in despair for not having realized God. And at that moment, Divine Mother reveals herself to him. But the way he describes this experience is extraordinary. And just think about it. His main practice before this first experience was very much devotion, and devotion directed toward Mother Kali, his beloved four-armed Mother Kali, divine form. But was his first experience an experience of Mother Kali with the four arms? No. Let's hear it from the man himself. He says, "It was as if the room, doors, temple, and everything else vanished altogether, as if there were nothing anywhere. But at the same time," he says, "I felt the immediate presence of the Divine Mother." But notice, this is not four-armed Mother Kali, it's in some other form. And he says, "And what I saw was an infinite, shoreless ocean of light. That ocean was consciousness. However far, in whatever direction I looked, I saw shining waves, one after another, coming towards me to swallow me up. They were madly rushing towards me from all sides with a terrific noise. Very soon they were upon me, and they pushed me down into unknown depths. I panted and struggled and lost consciousness." He means he lost external consciousness. And then, interestingly, after coming out of this experience, after coming down from that experience, after regaining external consciousness, what does he say? He says again and again, "Mother, Mother." So this is a very interesting question. Is this an experience of God with form or God without form? Is this an experience of the personal God or the impersonal absolute? I would say all of the above. Yes, 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 and yes, in a certain sense. But of course, it's been interpreted in different ways, even within our own tradition. It's quite fascinating, and some of you probably are not familiar with this. Among the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, there was some debate about how to interpret this very first spiritual experience of Sri Ramakrishna. Okay. Now, we have one mainstream account interpretation in Swami Sharadananda's biography of Sri Ramakrishna, where he talks about this experience. And he sees this experience as a kind of stepping stone to further, even greater and higher experiences. But there's another direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna named Swami Ramakrishna, one of the greatest devotees of Sri Ramakrishna, who disagreed. And he said that very first experience of Sri Ramakrishna's was the highest and the vastest, the most comprehensive. Everything else that followed was just him enjoying Divine Mother in different forms, but he had already realized the highest in that first experience. Where do I get this? This is from, for those of you who want to look it up, you can find the PDF online if you type it in. Siddheshwarananda, who's the first Swami who was in charge of our France Center in Gretz. He wrote an essay called Seeing Brahman with Open Eyes. And he says there, in the Sri Ramakrishna tradition, there are two currents of thought regarding the realizations of the master. The one that is popular is that indicated in Sharadananda's biography. Sharadananda seems to hold the view that in the master's realization, there is a gradual development culminating in his Advaitic realization. The highest is the non-dual realization he had when he was being trained by Totapuri. Okay, but that first experience is kind of a stepping stone toward that highest non-dual experience. But then Siddheshwarananda says, there's another tradition inspired by Swami Ramakrishna, where the notion of an evolution is replaced by the faith that in his experience of mother at the age of 19, that very first experience, at that historic moment when he thought of putting an end to his life, was not the starting point of higher and higher experiences, but the fund and center of all experience. All that he realized afterwards, he recognized as his mother. This tradition, whose principal spokesman is Swami Ramakrishnananda, is not written as a philosophical document. It's something that's been passed down verbally. Okay. But I think this is very important. And my own leanings are toward the Ramakrishnananda view. That this very first experience is what Sri Ramakrishna used to call vijnana. This realization of God at once as personal, saguna, and impersonal, nirguna, both with form, and just think about it. So he sees an infinite ocean of light, of bliss. What is that? That's the ocean of Satchitananda. Even if it's an ocean of consciousness, it's still an ocean. Isn't that a kind of form? And at the same time, it's a form corresponding to the formless. Is it a realization of the personal? Well, yes, because he says he felt the immediate presence of Divine Mother. And after regaining external consciousness, he said again and again, Mother, Mother. That's the personal God. But it also seems to be impersonal, the way that he's explaining this experience as being engulfed by these waves of infinite divine consciousness. So both with and without form, both personal and impersonal, I think he had the highest and greatest and vastest vijnana experience right at the very outset. And I also think this, that if you look at the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, the Kathamrita, you'll find that he often uses a particular metaphor, a metaphor of an infinite ocean to explain the nature of the divine. And I believe that one, I think, likely source for that teaching, for that analogy, that metaphor, was this first experience of that infinite ocean of divine consciousness. What is that metaphor? He used to say, imagine a vast, infinite ocean of Satchit Ananda, existence, consciousness, bliss. Under the cooling breeze of bhakti, there's a kind of, imagine a gentle breeze of bhakti, of devotion. He says, that water of the ocean forms into ice in different places in the ocean. Each of those forms of ice, those different ice formations, corresponds to different forms, divine forms, forms of the personal God. He says, God assumes forms for the sake of his or her bhaktas. Because she loves us, she wants to reveal herself to us in the form that we love most. And then he says, with the rising of the sun of knowledge, Jnana Surya, those ice forms melt. Now, if the metaphor, if the analogy stopped here, followers of Shankara would feel vindicated. They would say, see? The ice forms melt at the end of the day, which proves that the formless, impersonal absolute is higher or greater or truer than divine forms. But then, Sri Ramakrishna goes further, and he says, in some places, the ice doesn't melt at all. It becomes like quartz. And he gives it a name. He says there are what are called eternal divine forms, Nitya Sakara. Nitya means eternal. We're sitting here now. Nitya Sakara, eternal forms of the divine. Nitya Sakara. This is an extraordinary idea. Many traditions don't believe in it, but Sri Ramakrishna did. That's how vast his realization was. And this also, some of you might have attended a talk I gave here a few months ago it was on Hinduism and explaining what are the main tenets of Hinduism. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about what Hinduism is. If someone were to ask you, hey, what exactly does Hinduism teach? Many people think that it's polytheistic, that it believes in many gods and goddesses, which in a certain sense it does, but that doesn't mean it's polytheistic. Some other people think it's monotheistic, that they believe in one God, like Christianity or Islam or so on. I don't think it's quite either of those. It shares similarities with both, but I suggested in that talk, and I'll just repeat it here very quickly, I believe that Hinduism is best understood as a polymorphic monism. Polymorphic monism. Monism means there's one divine reality, okay, which is equally personal and impersonal, but which is polymorphic. Morph means form, so poly means many. That one infinite, impersonal, personal divine manifests in countless forms. That's the view of Hinduism. That's the doctrine of Hinduism. How is monism different from monotheism? Monotheism limits God to just the personal God. That's what theism means, the personal God. So monism is broader because it accepts that there's also an impersonal dimension to the infinite divine. And polymorphic monism, why? Because that one infinite divine manifests in countless forms. This is neither polytheism nor is it monotheism. It's a polymorphic monism. Okay, and Sri Ramakrishna taught this on the basis of his own varied and eclectic spiritual experiences. Okay. And there are many other examples I can give from his life. For instance, there's a fascinating one, 1864. A monk who's a great devotee of Ram Lal, which is a child form of Rama, one of the avatars worshipped in India. Okay, Ramachandra. He had a kind of metal image of Ram Lala that he would take around with him all the time, worship, play with. And so he comes to Dakshineshwar, where Sri Ramakrishna lived, and they become friends. And his name was Jatadhari. Jatadhari. And he's very spiritually evolved. He already had mystical visions. He was a mystic in his own right. And of course, we have Sri Ramakrishna on the other hand. And it's an extraordinary play that they have, where both of these great mystics, they play with Ram Lala. There's this one metal image. They don't see Ram Lala as a metal image. They see the living Ram Lal in the metal image. They don't see it as metal at all. They see it as an embodiment of divine consciousness. And they both see Ramlala playing in the same way. And this is very unusual. Some skeptics say that mystical experiences are subjective because they can't be cross-checked in the way that, if I say that I see this iPad in front of me, any of you in this room can check whether what I'm saying is true. How? By checking to see whether there's an iPad in front of me. That's called cross-checking. And some skeptics, some people who don't believe in mystical experiences, they'll say things like, well, see, mystical experiences can't be cross-checked in the way that sense experiences can be. If I see a Christmas tree there, you can also cross-check by trying to see the same Christmas tree. And if you do, you verify my claim. You can't do that with mystical experiences. And one philosopher who makes this argument, his name is Evan Fales. He makes a funny pun about this. Many of you have heard of the Christian mystic St. John of the Cross. He says, St. John of the Cross checks, he is not. Which means mystics can't cross-check each other's experiences. This is a counterexample. This is one of these extraordinary cases in the history of global mysticism where one mystic directly cross-checks another mystic's experience. They're both seeing Ramlal play in the same way, moving around, talking. I mean, doesn't really speak in words, but, the kind of blabber of infants. It's remarkable. And I talk about this because I think it has profound philosophical implications. I talk about it in chapter, 5 or 6 of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. So you can, if you're interested, you can look at the book for details. Another practice that he underwent in the same year, 1864, Totapuri, the naked wandering Advaita Vedantin, comes to Dakshineshwar. And he was a wandering monk who never stayed in one place as a rule for more than a few days. He was so taken by Sri Ramakrishna and his spiritual stature and greatness that he stayed for months at a stretch. And with the permission of Divine Mother, Sri Ramakrishna starts to learn Advaita Vedanta from him. And Totapuri starts to teach him. And Sri Ramakrishna is, the greatest possible disciple and spiritual aspirant. And yet, he's not able to attain Nirvikalpa Samadhi. He keeps getting stuck. And he tells Totapuri in despair, he says, I have no problem forgetting about the things of this world, but I'm getting stuck at the form of Divine Mother, my beloved Kali. I can't go beyond her. And he says, what? You say you cannot? And he takes a shard of glass and he just pricks him between the eyebrows. And then Sri Ramakrishna imagines or sees, actually feels, experiences that his Divine Mother Kali is being sliced in half with the sword of knowledge. And then his mind soars into Nirvikalpa Samadhi, and he has the direct realization of non-dual pure consciousness. And again, if you just take that in isolation out of context, you might think this also vindicates the non-dual school of Vedanta, because the divine form of Kali needs to be sliced in half for you to realize non-dual Brahman. But the story continues. Even when he comes back from the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, what does he do? He worships Divine Mother again. He still goes to the temple, bows down to the image. And Totapuri is completely befuddled and astonished. And he's saying, what is going on? And he's clapping to Divine Mother, in ecstatic devotion. And Totapuri makes fun of him and says, what are you, making chapatis? That's how you make chapatis. Totapuri doesn't get it. You've realized the higher truth, which is non-dual Brahman. Why the heck are you still worshipping divine form? It's very weird to him. What happens? Totapuri he began as Sri Ramakrishna's Advaita Guru. But slowly what happens is that the roles start to change. And Totapuri becomes the disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. How does that happen? Well, Totapuri comes down with some very serious stomach ailment. And even before he met Sri Ramakrishna, he was already a Brahma Jnani. He was already a knower of Brahman. And so he knew that the body is an illusion. It's completely irrelevant whether he's in the body or not. And so he thought to himself, I've already realized Brahman, and this body is causing me a lot of difficulty. Let me cast off this body. Let me go drown in this river. And he goes to try to drown himself. And no matter how far he goes, he finds that he's not able to drown. And then he himself has this ecstatic vision of Divine Mother. And he tells Sri Ramakrishna, the omnipresent, this is how he feels in the midst of that experience. He says, the omnipresent Divine Mother cosmic mother, omnipotent mother. Mother is in the water and land. Mother is the body and the mind. Mother is illness and health. Mother is knowledge and ignorance. Mother is life and death. Whatever I see, hear, think, and imagine is mother. She turns yes into no and no into yes, and so on. What happens here? Sri Ramakrishna turns around and becomes Guru to Totapuri. Totapuri came to him as a jnani, what Sri Ramakrishna used to call the jnani, who is somebody who has realized non-dual Brahman, the impersonal, formless, absolute, but who doesn't believe in the personal God. Sri Ramakrishna was a Vijnani, and he turned around and made Totapuri accept this higher and vaster realization of the divine in the form of Vijnana, realizing that the divine is both Brahman and Shakti, and that the two are non-different. They're just the static and dynamic aspects of the same infinite divine truth. Okay. So there are many questions that might arise. One might be, isn't it contradictory to believe in God with form and God without form? And Mohandranath Gupta, who's the author of the Gospel, he asked Sri Ramakrishna this question early on when he first started meeting Sri Ramakrishna. He says, Sri Ramakrishna asks him, well, do you believe in God with form or without form? And then M writes, he says, M, rather surprised, said to himself, how can one believe in God without form when one believes in God with form? And if one believes in God without form, how can one believe that God has a form? Can these two contradictory ideas be true at the same time? Can a white liquid like milk be black? This is the way most people think. That's why so many spiritual traditions either believe in the divine as formless or with form, but very few believe in both. It's interesting. They become one-sided in a certain way. They limit the divine either to the formless or to some form, right? Or some combination of forms. And then the dialogue continues. M, sir, I like to think of God as formless. He prided himself on being a rationalist. He was highly educated, follower of the Brahma Samaj. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, very good. It is enough to have faith in either aspect. You believe in God without form. That is quite all right. But never for a moment think that this alone is true and all else false. Remember that God with form is just as true as God without form, but hold fast to your own conviction. Remember the ocean analogy. That's exactly what the ocean analogy is meant to convey. And then M writes, he was astonished. He says, the assertion that both are equally true amazed M. He had never learned this from his books. Thus his ego received another blow. But since it was not yet completely crushed, he came forward to argue with the master a little more. So when he first met Sri Ramakrishna, he got 3 blows to his ego. And this is the second. Or I guess it's the third blow. But he gets yet another one. When he asks Sri Ramakrishna a question, he says, sir, suppose one believes in God without form. Suppose one believes in God with form. Certainly he's not the clay image. So even if you believe in divine forms, okay, he can stomach Mother Kali with 4 arms and Hanuman and all that. But the idea of worshipping an image, it's idol worship to him. It doesn't make sense. Sri Ramakrishna, interrupting. But why clay? It is a living manifestation of divine consciousness. Chinmoy Pratima. M could not quite understand the significance of this living manifestation of divine consciousness, Chinmoy Pratima. But sir, he said to the master, one should explain to those who worship the clay image that it is not God, and that while worshiping it, they should have God in view and not the clay image. One should not worship clay. Sri Ramakrishna, sharply. That's the one hobby of you Calcutta people, giving lectures and bringing others to the light. Nobody ever stops to consider how to get the light himself. Who are you to teach others? He who is the Lord of the universe will teach everyone. Sri Ramakrishna directly realized the divine present in the form of the divine image. If God is everywhere, how can God not be in the image? Just think about it that way. And there's a special manifestation of the divine in these divine images that are worshipped, especially by people who have realized the divine by worshiping that image. It becomes even more suffused with the divine consciousness. Another philosophical question that arises, what exactly is the highest spiritual goal? Okay. And I've talked about this before, I'll just mention it again briefly. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, there are two fundamentally different forms of liberation. And he would use a metaphor to explain them. Eating sugar versus becoming sugar. Okay. So for Advaita Vedantins, followers of non-duality, the goal for them is not to go to any kind of heaven, but to merge their individuality, lose themselves in non-dual pure consciousness. That's what Sri Ramakrishna calls becoming sugar. But bhaktas, those who love the personal God, they don't want that. They don't want to become sugar. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, bhaktas don't want to become sugar, they want to eat sugar. So what is eating sugar? What does that mean? It means we dwell in an eternal heaven, in an eternal loka, an eternal realm, with our beloved personal God, in whatever form that we love most. And Sri Ramakrishna does not put the Advaitic ideal on a higher footing than the devotional ideal of dwelling in an eternal heaven with the personal God. Now, each of you might be thinking, well, I prefer one or the other. That's great. That's a matter of temperament. But never for a moment say, just because I like X, therefore X is greater than Y. With food, we tend not to make that mistake. One person likes Italian food more than Chinese, another person likes Chinese more than Italian. But very few people are going to say that Chinese food is objectively better than Italian food. It's a matter of temperament. But when it comes to spirituality and religion, suddenly people become very dogmatic and fanatical and one-sided. And so Sri Ramakrishna reminds us that also has to do with temperament. The divine is infinite. And the divine manifests as Christ to people who love to think of God as Christ. That same divine manifests as Allah to Muslims. The same divine manifests as Krishna to Vaishnavas. The same divine manifests as Kali to Shaktas, and so on. It's the same divine. It's a matter of temperament and preference. Where does Sri Ramakrishna say this? Mohima Chakraborty, who was a non-dualist, a follower of Shankara, he said, I have a question to ask, sir. A lover of God needs nirvana sometime or other, doesn't he? And by nirvana, what he means is this becoming sugar. Dissolve your individuality in non-dual Brahman. Staying in a heaven seems like it's some kind of lesser ideal. He's thinking from a non-dualistic standpoint. Sri Ramakrishna answers as follows. It cannot be said that bhaktas, devotees of the personal God, need nirvana. According to some schools, there is an eternal Krishna, and there are also his eternal devotees. Krishna is consciousness embodied, and his abode also is consciousness embodied. Krishna is eternal, and the devotees also are eternal. So this devotional ideal of eating sugar is not on a lower footing. It's not lesser. It's not less true or real or valuable than becoming sugar. It's a matter of preference. So I like to think about this state of liberation as a many-roomed mansion. A mansion with many rooms. And there can be a Christian room, which is a kind of Christian heaven where Christians can dwell. There can be a Muslim room. There can be a Jewish room. There can be a Sikh room. There can be S-I-K-H, not S-I-C-K. And the Shakta room and the Vaishnava room and so on and so forth. And if you want, if you're an Advaita and you don't like that, or you're a Buddhist and you want just nothing but pure consciousness, you'll have that. It's another room. They won't call it a room, but we can think of it as metaphorically as a room, right? Let's say, if it's a room, then that's already duality. It compromises our non-duality. But I think it's a useful metaphor, right? At the same time, one person can be in the Christian room, another in the Muslim room. There's another common mistake that people make is to think that that liberation, the state of enlightenment, has to be monolithic, that there's just one picture of salvation or liberation, and that every liberated soul has to be experiencing exactly the same thing. But why is that the case? As we're sitting here now, there are billions of people throughout the world in other places. Even in this one monastery, there might be people in other rooms. Why can't that be the case in the state of liberation as well? So it seems to stand to reason as well. One objection for people, those of you who are familiar with Sri Ramakrishna's teachings in the gospel, he'll sometimes say things like this. He'll say, when one thinks of the divine from far away, one thinks of it as having 8 arms. And then as you get closer, the number of arms starts decreasing. You start seeing the 6-armed goddess, and then 4 arms, and then 2 arms, and then no arms, and then you see nothing but divine light as you come very close. So some people think, well, isn't he also privileging the formless above God with form? But look carefully at the context when he says it. I'll give you an example. October 18th, 1885. He's talking to a highly rationalistic doctor named Dr. Sharkot, who has trouble believing in God with form. So Sri Ramakrishna knew his temperament, and he says, well, you love reasoning. So he's talking to him in particular. He says, well, you love reasoning. All right, let us reason a little. As you go nearer to God, you see less and less of his upadhis, his attributes. A devotee at first may see the deity as a 10-armed divine mother. When he goes nearer, he sees her possessed of 6 arms. Still nearer, he sees the deity as a 2-armed Gopala. The nearer he comes to the deity, the fewer attributes he sees. At last, when he comes into the presence of the deity, he sees only light without any attributes. Why does he say this? That teaching was tailored to Dr. Sharkar because he can't stomach divine forms. And so he says, okay, I'll give you a teaching that'll help you on your spiritual path because you have trouble stomaching divine forms. But that doesn't apply to everybody, as we know from his own experiences in his own life, right? And he says this again. I'll give you just another example. December 22nd, 1883. He says, one who worships God without form perhaps sees at first the deity with 10 arms, then the deity with 4 arms, then the baby Krishna with 2 arms. At last he sees the indivisible light and merges in it. But notice the qualification, one who worships God without form. So that's because they're already inclined to believing in God without form, right? But his own position is captured in that infinite ocean metaphor. They're eternal forms of the divine, which you can directly realize through worship and prayer. So, just to sum up, I would suggest that there are 5 main takeaways here. First, don't make the common mistake of mixing up impersonality with formlessness. Remember the 2 axes and the 4 terms. Saguna, nirguna, so personal, impersonal, and nirakara, sakara, without form and with form. So just because you believe in the formless doesn't mean that you believe that the divine is impersonal. You can also believe in the formless but personal God. Okay? Second, don't think of worship of and meditation on God with form as a kind of lower practice. It's not a lower practice at all. They're fully real. They're not just mental hallucinations. They're not just imaginative fancies. It's the way that the divine lovingly manifests to each of us, because God knows that he needs to be made accessible to us as human beings with finite minds and with our particular preferences. And I hope another takeaway is we should try to broaden, we should try to expand our understanding of what it means for God to have form. If you don't like the word God, think of the divine. So there's so many divine forms. God in the form of scripture, God in the form of human beings as incarnations, God in the form of all human beings, as each of us sitting here and everyone in the world. God in the form of nature, God in the form of mantra. The forms of God that we know in the Hindu tradition, like the 4-armed Kali and Ganesha and Hanuman. All of these are different forms of the divine, and God in the form of an image. God is literally present in the divine image that is worshipped. Now, I also wanted to mention, though, that there are some people who, it's not just that they have trouble meditating on a divine form, they can't, because they have a condition which is called aphantasia. Aphantasia. Phantasia means the ability to imagine things. Aphantasia means you lack that ability. So some people literally can't imagine anything. If you're told to think of a white elephant or a pink elephant, you can't. They can't, because they have this condition. So that means that when some people who have told me this, who get initiated in our tradition, and often gurus in our tradition will tell us to meditate on a divine form in the heart. And they can't, and it pains them. And we should be sympathetic to that. We should have empathy for them and understand. And the beauty of it is, yeah, that's fine. It's okay that you can't meditate on the divine form, because remember, the same divine is also formless, so don't worry about it. So think about the divine and meditate on the divine in any form that's helpful to you. And that mantra that you've been given, even if you can't think of the divine form, the mantra itself is another form of the divine. So by repeating that mantra mentally, which is called japa, that's another form of meditation on the divine form, actually. It's just in the form, the divine in the form of the mantra. So focus on the mantra. You don't have to visualize anything, but you can concentrate and meditate on the mantra while thinking of the divine. Okay. Why is it so helpful to worship God with form? Because most of us are addicted to the forms in this world. That's our main ailment. That's our disease, our sickness. We're trying to break that addiction through spiritual practice. What's the best way to do it? Think more and more of what I would call a divine counterform. Any form of the divine, the more you think about it, the more you grow a taste for that form of the divine, the less tasteful, the less you find interest in these worldly forms. What do I mean by worldly forms? Anything. Look at social media and everything. People are obsessed with forms, in the form of human bodies, other human bodies, for instance. People look at each other as bodies. That's a worldly form, right? It's much easier. So just imagine whoever you're most in love with, for instance. It's very easy to imagine that person, right? But then the same person will say, I have a lot of trouble imagining God. That's because they're more attracted to, they're more interested in worldly forms. So by meditating on the divine form, you gradually wean yourself away from your addiction to worldly forms. That's the idea. Okay. I wanted to close by mentioning an incident that takes place early in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna when M first starts visiting Sri Ramakrishna. And Sri Ramakrishna's beloved Narendra, who later went on to become Swami Medhananda, he was a great singer. So he started singing a song. Meditate, O my mind, on the Lord Hari, the stainless one, pure spirit through and through. How peerless is the light that in him shines. How soul bewitching is his wondrous form. How dear is he to all his devotees. Ever more beauteous in fresh blossoming love that shames the splendor of a million moons. Like lightning gleams the glory of his form, raising erect the hair for very joy. Sri Ramakrishna shuddered when this last line was sung. His hair stood on end, and tears of joy streamed down his cheeks. Now and then his lips parted in a smile. So notice the song is about the wondrous sublimity of the divine form, and talking about how if you meditate deeply on the divine form, you'll experience what's called horripilation. Your hairs will actually stand on end. Sri Ramakrishna, while listening to the song, literally goes into a state of samadhi, and his hair stands on end. And everybody in the room is witnessing that. So let's always maintain a prayerful and humble attitude and take the name of the divine, meditate on the divine form in the form of the mantra at the very least, and also try our best to meditate on different forms of God so that our lives will be blessed. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.